Hey, and welcome. Looking forward to spending some time with you on today's session. My name is Stuart Hayden, and I'm going to be your host for the session, so I'll be somewhat in the background, making sure everything runs to plan. We've got a few polls coming our way where you get to cast your votes, so we'll administer those. I'll keep an eye on the chat. It's great to see what we've already been talking about, albeit just to warm up the chat function in terms of where you're dialing in from, and of course, what the weather's like throughout the world. So keep an eye on that. You can post questions there, observations as you're going through. That's always really helpful. And like I say, I'll keep an eye on that as we go through. We've got a Q&A session, question and answer session right at the very end. So we can hold any great questions till later on. Of course, if we need to do anything as we're going through, we'll pick those up the whole way through. Just to mention, this session is going to be recorded, so you can get a copy of that. So if you want to kind of think about particular sections of interest to you, you can go back and take a look at that. And of course, you can share that with wider colleagues in the network as well. So it will be on the CIPD website. It takes a while for us to get the recording and actually put it onto the website, because we have to get it from the webinar platform, but it should be there shortly. So a couple of things to remember. Keep an eye on that chat function as you're going through, and this session is going to be recorded, so that's all good. So this session is webinar number 2 of 3. As Ali's already mentioned, it's going to focus on awareness. The first session is also going to be on the website. We're going to record that and place that there as well. And number 3, the final session, is going to be on the 30th of April. You can attend these webinars standalone, one of them, 2 of them, or all 3 of them. It doesn't really make much difference, but just to let you know, we're right in the middle. We're in the webinar ethics sandwich. One's gone and one to come, as I said, on the 30th of April. So this was a slide I saw earlier, but just to make sure everybody's in the environment as best they can. The main thing is to get the chat going, which we can see is going great, comes already. But click on that icon down there. It looks like a chat bubble, like a speech bubble in cartoons, to make sure you've got the chat. Should pop up to the right-hand side, and you can see the comments coming through as we go through. If you want to make a comment, you can connect to the panelists directly. Just be mindful when they're presented, they don't really tend to be able to focus on that and the slides, but I can keep an eye on that if you have questions, observations, or anything you want more clarity on. And if you're comfortable posting to all participants, you can do so as well, depends on what kind of content you want to post. So hopefully you're pretty warmed up with the webinar environment. You should be able to see the slides. They're going to start moving through. And of course, you should have the audio by now. If for any reason you can't, you want to go back into the Communicate tab right at the top that you can see there. But I think there's a lot of activity, so I think we should be good to go. So there I am, Stuart Hayden, on the top left-hand side. I'm a commercial living consultant at CIPD. Ali's going to take over the reins in terms of presenting first. She's worked at the CIPD. She's in the same team as myself. She's worked there for the last 9 years, and she recently co-authored our Ethics at Work guide. So she's one of our co-authors. We heard from Tina Russell for the first webinar, and we're grateful to hear from Ali this time. She's got hopefully two guest speakers. We're trying to work hard to get Marco into the webinar environment. Marco Alvera is the Chief Executive Officer for SNAM. That's one of the world's largest leading energy infrastructure companies. And Marco wrote the book Generation H on hydrogen's potential as a clean energy resource, and came to our attention via a TED Talk, which I'll post later in the slides and in the chat, which I've taken a look at, and it's an excellent talk. So if you want to look at that, you can do. So thanks, Mark. I hope you'll be able to get through the webinar environment and join us.
Hi, Stuart. Sorry to disturb you. It's just Mark. I think I've got Marco on. I'm just going to do a very quick sound check. Hi, Marco. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you. Sorry, Stuart. I'll go back on mute now.
No, that's perfect time, and it's always helpful to know if I'm presenting someone who's actually with us. So, Marco, great to have you on board, and thanks for getting through the tech problems to get you here. Aidan's been with us since about 12 o'clock, so I'm sure he's still with us. And Aidan Thompson is Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, and leads on directed strategic initiatives, managing partnerships, and the integration of research projects undertaken by the centre. I know he's going to do some good work around virtues, which is a big interest area of mine a little bit later on. So that's everybody in terms of all 105 of us introduced to the webinar environment, introduced to our presenters. So I'm going to hand over to Ali now, who's going to start the presentation. She'll then hand over to Marco and Aidan. As I said, do post any questions or observations you've got going through, but we'll take them predominantly at the end of the session. We'll open up a Q&A. We'll have to manage time slightly because I appreciate we started a little bit late, but let's see where we are once we've heard from Ali and Marco and Aidan. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. If you could just pass over the slides to me. Brilliant. I think I've got them. So hopefully everyone's seen this next slide, which should be the CIPD Profession map. So thank you very much, Stuart, and welcome everyone. Hello, I hope you're all well. I'm going to start with a little bit about the context of ethics. And ethical practice has been on the CIPD agenda for some years now, and especially in the wake of rising corporate scandals. So when we started to plan for the redesign of our profession map about 3 years ago, ethics was made provision for. And what you can see on the screen now is our new profession map, and that was launched last year. So if you're not familiar with this new map, here is a brief overview of the CIPD standards, and we've separated them into sort of core knowledge, specialist knowledge, and also our core behaviours. And we've included ethical practice within our core behaviours section, as you can actually see here. So please do at some other time go and familiarise yourself with the map if you're not already familiar. So we've we at the CIPD actually describe ethical practice to be building trust by role modelling ethical behaviour and applying principles and values consistently in decision making. So alongside this move to include ethical practice in our profession map, our research team produced this evidence-based report in April 2019. And this report is called Rotten Apples, Bad Barrels and Sticky Situations. It's a comprehensive review of the extensive research out there on unethical workplace behaviour. This report actually provides evidence-based lessons that people professionals and our leaders can use to minimise the likelihood of unethical behaviour in their workplace. It explores what drives unethical workplace behaviour and also provides recommendations to build more ethical workplaces. There is, Stuart's actually going to be popping URLs in our chat box, which he's done for me, thanks Stuart, so that you can actually go through those and there's some direct links for you. So on the back of that, it was really closely followed up by this guide launched last November, which I actually co-authored alongside my colleague Tina Russell, who ran the first webinar for us on Speak Up. We actually take the recommendations of the 9 action areas employers can prioritise seen here. And we actually set about writing practical guidance on what to look out for. So things like the warning signs that could lead to unethical behaviour, such as a rise in grievances, or those anomalous comments we see from our engagement surveys. I'm sure we've all seen them, those of you in HR and also in management positions. And we refer to those as red flags. And we've then provided practical advice and solutions that you can take to make changes and, of course, look into sort of mitigating against those risks. But today, the area we're going to explore, and I'm going to talk about more, and so my guest speakers, is more closely today, is fairness and organisational politics. So, we define fairness as organisations that treat their workforce with fairness, integrity and sensitivity are then more likely to find that the workforce responds with increased commitment and also productivity. However, we have uncovered that individuals are more likely to act unethically if they perceive their organisation to be unfair. So, for example, if your reward or resources aren't shared fairly, or policies and procedures are a little bit inconsistent. And we also find that a workforce will look to their leaders for behavioural norms. So, the first thing I would like to ask you is, and this is an opinion poll, and Stuart will hopefully sort of bring this up in a minute, to what extent is fairness role modelled by your leaders in your organisation? So hopefully that's going to come up in just a second. Let's see. Poll.
Just going to open that one now. So,
Thanks, Stuart. Lovely. So what we have is we have 3 responses for you. I'd like to answer, and that's A, B, and C. A is very highly, B to some extent, and C, improvement needed. So you should see the poll on your screen now. If you could all vote, and we'll see how that comes out. So to what extent is fairness role modelled by your leaders in your organisation? Is that A, very highly, B, to some extent, or C, improvement needed?
Okay, the votes are coming thick and fast. Over 3/4 of us have found the polling function. Don't worry if you can't find it for any particular reason. You can stick it in the chat if you want, or really the main power here is just reflecting on this question personally. So I'm going to close it down.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a delay, isn't it, Stuart?
Yeah, it just takes about sort of 20 seconds to actually collate the results. So they're just starting to come through now, and then I'll share those with you in the next 5 or 6 seconds, and then we can see what sort of response we've got on the group today. Just coming through now. Have a look. Okay, it should be coming through.
Okay, oh, that's interesting. So we've got no answer there as well, but actually to some extent. So that is about just under half of you, which is really encouraging to see. And my answer to that is, you know, if you're in an HR capacity, perhaps you can use your influence and also provide guidance, maybe start to have a look at your policies and practices, or even maybe review the values to see if there is any inconsistency. Thank you for that. And moving on, the other area we focus on in the guide under the Fairness tab is organisational politics. And these are the policies, your procedures and practices that could be deemed unfair. So that's why we recommend that an audit is carried out to ensure they are ethical in nature, fair, and also equitable. And you know, we found that the effort required to navigate organisational politics can actually create a strain for some people. It also can reduce their self-determination, and we really don't want that. And that's a result of a lack of intrinsic motivation or diminishing motivation. So if nothing is done to rectify the situation, our research has found that this is causing a reduced sense of relatedness and increasing alienation. And that's been seen to result in unethical behaviour. So what I mean by that is this could result in people protecting their own interests above ethical considerations for other people and your organisation. So another area I want to share with you, this can also be seen in productivity as well. And research tells us that the percentage value in salary on employee retention and also engagement can range from 120% in fully engaged employees to 60% in our disengaged employees. And I'm sure that, you know, if people are actually experiencing unfairness in their organisation, that probably plays quite a large part in people feeling, you know, a little bit sort of disengaged. So I'm going to run another poll. So hopefully, Stuart, you're able to actually, this one I'm going to run in the chat box. So it might be sort of easier to have a look at that. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. So with your bonus your bonus payments, and with your budget sort of allocation for your yearly bonuses, would you disperse it equally amongst your workforce, or just your top performers? And we're quite keen to know. So this is a chat box answer. If you know what you would do, place either a 1, meaning give it to your top performers, or a 2, fairly, to all employees in the chat box. And let's see what comes up. Oh, we've got lots of 2s. Brilliant. We've got a 1. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it rather depends on how you deem talent within your organisation, I'm sure. I know a lot of organisations are looking to deem talent as the whole workforce and make sure that everyone is sort of valued the same. And I know that a lot of organisations are moving in that direction. Brilliant. So that's ones and twos. Excellent. Okay. But not to those performing poorly. Yes, no, I get that. And if that's from Kerry, I know Kerry, thank you very much for your response there. So neither we don't pay bonuses. Yep, there's many organisations who feel the same way. Thank you very much. That was a really quick poll. So what we're going to do is actually going to hand over to my first guest speaker, who is Marco. And so Stuart, if you don't mind passing your presenter rights to Marco, and then I'll take them back when he's done. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. I'm going to mute myself for the moment.
Can Stuart turn the pages, because I'm participating via audio and I don't see any presenter rights on this. Can someone turn the pages?
Yeah, no problem, Marco. I can do that for me. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, thank you, Alison, very much for having me on this webinar. Thanks to all the people participating. This is a very interesting topic for me. I've been studying and researching at different levels, fairness and ethics at work, and I've tried hard to put this into practice. I subscribe to everything that Alison said and to the CIPD work and methodology. There's a lot more research that I think needs to be brought to this field in terms of organization and behavior. I think where we are the strongest is at the neuroscience, and I'll touch a little bit about that. Given the time, and we started a little late, Alison, how many minutes would you like me to speak for at this point?
Okay, just go through the slides as you can, Marco, and we'll try to catch up. We've also got Aidan to speak as well. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try to stay within 12 minutes, maybe. Is that all right?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So I'll go quickly through the first slides. We all know that the problems we face as CEOs and as managers in companies are really very significant from a societal perspective. Both inequality and climate change have risen in the last 10 years as what keeps people up at night and what motivates or demotivates people. And the shape of companies, I'm now on page 20, the companies have also changed radically. We went very quickly from a world where organizations had a very strict hierarchy, like pyramids. We had defined roles. Information was shared only on a need-to-know basis. And we basically had boxes and people knew what the contour of their job was in a very formal way. Now, we've gone very quickly, because or thanks to social media, to a situation where there's no one you can shake his hand and then everything cascades down. You have to have multiple levels of dialogue within organizations. Collaboration is a lot more fluid. Boundaries are a lot more permeable. Boundaries between companies, between jobs within the same company. There's a request from employees and customers and suppliers for a total and 24/7 transparency. And so whilst the world is becoming a lot more complex, even before any health issues, the companies are becoming much more destructured. And as companies become destructured, I'm now on page 21, we see a real risk. I work in the energy space of very strong breakdown of trust between companies and societies. And there's a real risk that companies, if they don't work with a purpose, if they don't work ethically, if they don't work with fairness inside and outside, they can very quickly lose their license to operate. So on page 22, how can you build trust? How can you rebuild trust with communities and with shareholders, with employees? We think that fairness can really play a big role. We think there's a lot of science to back this up, and we can cover a little bit of that. But some of the points that Alison touched upon, processes are the key to having a more fair work environment. The selection process you use to hire people and also to promote people is very important. Equality of character, not only equality of gender or other qualities, really matters. We see people who are more outspoken take up an unfair share of meetings, and making sure that the quieter people, who often are the ones that have the better ideas, have an equal airtime of meetings is just one small example of how you can actually achieve fairness with improved processes. Also in the key area of capital allocation, resource allocation, processes have to be constantly audited to make sure that they are fair. There is a very strong correlation we found between transfer of information and fairness. The more information flows around, the more fairness there is. And then, of course, whistleblowing also plays a role. But why do we talk about the heart? Why do we talk about HQ? Well, in the 50s, everyone was focused on IQ. And still today, GMATs and many MBA entrance exams are still largely based on IQs and many selection processes in companies. I think IQ is kind of a need to have, but if you focus too much on IQ, then you have skewed people entering the workforce and entering leadership and doing MBAs, which may excel at IQs as places become much more competitive, but they may lack what we call HQ. In the 90s, with the book Emotional Intelligence, there was a big shift from IQ to EQ, or also to include EQ. We think EQ is interesting, but EQ on its own doesn't say much. The world and history books are full of very nasty people who had a lot of EQ. EQ means charisma, means being able to empathize with people, but doesn't necessarily mean to be fair and to treat people fairly. So we use this word HQ when we select the people we want to hire and when we select leaders within our companies and in our supply chain. Here there's a video that we won't share on page 23, but I invite those of you who haven't seen this to have a look. One of the most inspiring things for me in studying some of the neuroscience is to discover that animals, monkeys, but more importantly babies, when they're 5 months old, have an innate sense of fairness. We are all naturally attracted to a fair outcome when we experience on ourselves or on peers or even on people we don't know a fair outcome. We have a positive attitude. And when we experience an unfair outcome, if we go to page 24, the science is very, very strong. The pain we experience the pain we feel when we experience an unfair situation is exactly the same part of the brain and the same neurosystem as physical pain. And you can actually cure social pain or fairness pain with painkillers, which is then one of the reasons why there's, especially in the US, such a big opioid crisis. So when we feel we are treated unfairly, we enter a defensive mode, or the primitive reptile part of our brain switches off. And so we can no longer be creative, we don't have fun, we don't collaborate. And this sense of unfairness is experienced by 70% of respondents in a big US survey. They feel they're not treated fairly at work. And some people calculate that this costs around $700 billion US dollars of loss economic growth just because of disengagement in the workforce. And this was a little controversial 2 years ago when I started talking about this. I've been very happy to see people, and now on page 25, like Larry Fink of BlackRock, really come out publicly. They are, BlackRock is the biggest shareholder in most of the listed companies. He really came out publicly saying that companies need to essentially be fair and have a higher sense of purpose. Otherwise, they will lose a license to operate. This was last year's letter. This year's letter was even more explicit. And you see ESG, where we talk about environment, social, and governance, is gaining more and more ground in the eyes of investors. Rating agencies are beginning to promote and realize some ESG scorecards, ESG ratings. And so you'll very soon have companies that are ranked not only for profits and stock price performance, but also for ESG performance. That I think is going to be a very positive force, both for environmental reasons and for ethical, social, and governance reasons. What we did in SNAM, we were a 100% fossil fuel company. We're very quickly accelerating the energy transition, investing on biomethane, waste to energy, investing on hydrogen, investing on sustainable mobility. What we did in order to inspire everyone and do this is launch an internal university called SNAM Institute and a foundation called SNAM Foundation that we use to do not-for-profit activities. We've recently been able to give 20 million euros for the coronavirus, but more importantly, we've been able to use our network and our context to help governments source key ventilators and protective equipment for doctors. And we've been able to do that because we've put the entire organization at the service of the foundation. So it's not just about money, it's about deploying the capabilities. So when we had to inspire everyone, not only we had the hard instruments of a foundation and an internal university, but we really wanted to come up with a purpose. And on page 27, we used this model that Aristotle invented more than 2,000 years ago, that basically Aristotle said about people, but we think it applies to companies as well, where your unique talents intersect the needs of the world. That is your purpose. Purpose is the reason you exist. And so we defined, we spent a few months working with most of our colleagues, trying to define what our unique skills were, and you see that on the left side. And then we asked ourselves what the world needs, which is cleaner, secure, abundant, cheap energy and complex delivery. And we then drew up our purpose, which you can see on page 28, is energy to inspire the world. So in our governance box, the purpose is the highest up. Then we have the vision, the mission, the values, the strategy. But what's really inspiring us every day is our purpose. That's the reason we exist. That's kind of who we are and why we come at work. And we found that it goes miles to just explain very simply why we want to make a difference and to rally people to be more engaged and to put in their best effort to make a difference. So I've covered a lot of ground. These are complex topics. Here you have some ways to keep in touch. I'm active on LinkedIn, where you can feel free to write to me and message me, and I'll reply. But I think there's also room for Q&A later on this webinar. I hope the audio worked well and it was all clear. Thanks.
Marco, thank you very much. Yeah, please stay on the webinar, and what we'll do is that we'll field some questions to you at the end. And just one that did come through, Marco, was, what does the H stand for in HQ you were talking about in relation to IQ and EQ?
IQ is intelligence quotient, EQ is emotional, and HQ is heart quotient.
Heart, so, lovely. That's great. Thank you ever so much. So that's one question I actually saw come through in the chat box. So, and thank you very much for that, Marco. It was really, really great. I know that you know, everything that you do and everything at your core is very much around about fairness. So thanks for sharing those slides with us. We'll come back to you. And so if I could just have the slide coming on. In fact, just before I actually introduce you to my next guest speaker, which is Aidan Thompson, and I just actually want to ask you this question. Let's get everyone up and sort of thinking about this as well. So, is fairness about treating everyone the same? Okay, and that would be answer A. Or is fairness about treating everyone with the same respect? So I can see that on my screen. So if you could start responding to A or B, that'd be marvelous. And we'll reveal the results as soon as we can. And just to let you know that my next speaker, Aidan Thompson, he's going to actually be addressing this. This is a question that we were discussing when we were chatting a couple of weeks ago. So he will pick up on this the answers and the responses that come through when he comes to his part of the presentation, which is the very next few slides. So how are we doing, Stuart?
We've got 7 or 8 seconds left, just coming through. So
all right, great.
Nice high response level.
Good. Interesting to find out whether sort of A or B. Right, okay, that's really interesting. So what we can see is treating everyone with the same respect. It came out at around about just under 2/3 of you responded that way, with a very small percentage saying about everyone the same. And thanks ever so much, Stuart. I'll tell you what, if you wouldn't mind handing over the presenter rights to Aidan, I'm going to hand over to Aidan, and he's going to be talking about his role and what his definition of fairness and where that comes to with his work that he's done on virtues. Thanks, Aidan, and over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks very much to Marco. When I was speaking to Ali about doing this webinar, I didn't know what Marco was going to talk about. And actually, having seen the slides yesterday and hearing Marco's presentation today, hopefully these are going to dovetail quite nicely. The reason I wanted to start off by asking that question around fairness is possibly plays into the first poll that Ali asked about the sharing of bonuses and actually what fairness looks like in the workplace and what it means for us, not just from a top-down level, but actually for us as members of the workforce, as middle managers, as senior managers, and people that manage other people. How do we make sure that we are acting fairly on a day-to-day basis? And perhaps using that example of the sharing of bonuses just to articulate what the purpose of that poll was, is to say a little bit more about what fairness might look like. So there was 1 response or 2 responses in the chat to say that sharing bonuses equally is maybe an unfair thing to do if you've got lower performing members of staff, or maybe you've got certain people that maybe aren't deserving of a bonus. And that's kind of the purpose of it, that actually if you've got £1 million to split between 100 people, you may not want to give everybody the same amount of money. You may want to split that up in a different way. But how do you determine, how do you act fairly, and how do you determine what fairness is in terms of, in that case, the right amount to give? My name's Aidan Thompson. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at a research centre at the University of Birmingham called the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues. And we launched in 2012, so we've been going nearly 8 years now. And we've done a huge amount of research and collected a massive amount of data, working with schools, working with universities, and working with professionals across a number of different professions. And it's some of that professional data that we've collected that I want to talk to you about today. We are the Centre for Character and Virtues, and what we mean by that is that our character is who we are, and what makes up our character are the virtues. And what we've done in our research is use the virtues, and there are almost infinite number of virtues, and we've always tried to kind of limit ourselves into how many we talk about at times. But what we've done in our work in the professions is give people at entry level, at experience level, and at studying those at undergraduate level the same surveys and the same list of virtues, and ask them which virtues are important to you. And on this slide, we have 24 virtues, and they are taken from a measure called the Values in Action Survey, which has been done by millions of people worldwide, and I'm about to post a link to it in the chat box as I'm talking. And it's very easy to do if you are interested in looking at it, and what it does is give you a good idea of the virtues that are important to you. Other people might use the word value, or other people might use the word character strength, or something like that. We use virtues. And we've asked over 3,500 professionals and trainee professionals, which virtues are important to you? And we ask this in 2 ways. We ask this, which virtues are important to you personally, and which virtues are important to you professionally and in the workplace. And whilst we would always advocate and say that you are the same person at home as you are in the office, we have found some interesting differences between those virtues that people report being important to them personally and those that are important to them professionally. The professions that we've worked with are the medical profession, the nursing profession, both very, very important to us right at this moment worldwide, teachers, lawyers, and a mixture of business and finance professionals. And we're very grateful to the CIPD for helping us access their membership in terms of this survey a couple of years ago. But what we found, looking across those 5 professions, and what we've published in a report last year called Repurposing the Professions, is that there were 8 personal virtues that came out very, very clearly, almost well above any of the other 16, and 7 professional virtues which came out very, very clearly, well and above the other 70. And for those that are very quick to look at this, these 2 boxes, you can see that actually 7 of the 8 virtues are the same on both sides of the table. There was only humour, which came out as a 4th important personal virtue, which didn't appear as a professional virtue. But honesty, single most important virtue, both personally and professionally. But relevant to this webinar, fairness came out as the 2nd most important virtue that people regarded as part of their personal lives, and the 3rd most important in the workplace after judgment. So there's something to be said there around kind of what fairness looks like, what fairness means as managers and as senior managers and CEOs and directors, but also what fairness means as part of the general workforce. So before I move on and talk more broadly a little bit more about the wider research, what we wanted to do was ask another poll of you, which is, so based on those virtues, those 8 in the personal virtues, and I can read them back out again, is which of these virtues is most important to you of all? And they're honesty, fairness, kindness, humour, teamwork, perseverance, judgment, and leadership.
Perfect, thanks Aidan. I've just opened the poll. Obviously it's the 3rd one now, so people are pretty rapidly in there, albeit there's a bit of a wider choice this time. So I'll let it run. It's flying through. Just going to close it down there. Apologies if you haven't quite, I'm still doing actually. God, we're down into the teens. There's like a poll within the poll in terms of how many people have managed to find the functions. So let me close that down. And then it will shortly share with us all. And I think it's going to be very interesting, the results. Should be with you in about 5 or 6 seconds.
Okay. I've just read the question from Angela about HR, which is particularly interesting. Coming from a university background, I have my own opinions on university HR, but I'll come to that question towards the end. So, okay, maybe primed by the topic of this webinar, and that maybe you're all a bit more inclined or interested in the notion of fairness, but fairness coming out 2nd there to honesty. And honesty may be being reiterated in terms of our own research as being the single most important virtue to people in the workplace and personally. But some interesting ones there that humour doesn't feature so highly, only 2 people picking out humour, 14 people picking out kindness, and maybe in the world we live in right here and now, kindness is being emphasised very much online, about how we interact with one another and how we protect ourselves and how we make sure that we engage with kindness, engage with other people with kindness. Thank you very much for indulging me with that survey. In terms of fairness then, and fairness in the workplace, so 3,500 professionals ranking fairness as either 2nd or 3rd most important virtue to them, depending whether they're talking about personally or professionally. But what does fairness mean? And we would, as I've said, regard it as an important personal and an integral professional virtue, but we would call that a moral virtue. And it's important for us to differentiate between the different types of virtue. And the 8 that I've highlighted for us in this poll come into different categories and how the Jubilee Centre categorises them. Marco's already referenced Aristotle, and I didn't know that he was going to do that when I prepared my slides. We are an Aristotelian research centre. We do follow the teachings of Aristotle in our work, but we apply them to the 21st century. And what we try and do is, where Aristotle regarded character as being constituted of the virtues, we then tried to differentiate those into 4 different categories. And we call those categories the intellectual virtues, those that allow us to think, reason, and apply judgment and wisdom. The moral virtues, and those that enable us to act ethically in a given situation. The civic virtues, those that allow us to engage with our wider society and ensure that character building is not just done for personal and individual benefit, but for society as well. And the performance virtues, which we would say are the instrumental virtues which enable the other three to be enacted. So fairness here is a moral virtue and having components of integrity and having components of justice and maybe service as well around it, but very much morally focused. And fairness is something that is probably noticed when it is absent rather than when it is present. And then where I've put there at the bottom, associated with interpersonal care and self-control, that links more broadly to the notion of purpose. And we as a Jubilee Centre advocate that developing one's character or focusing on one's character and individual virtues, the general output of good character development is a focus on purpose and allows us to do things with purpose and organisations to act with purpose. Again, linking back to what Mark has said. I'll just reference one of the reports that we have published on this, or two of the reports actually, sorry. Firstly, we found that groups of professionals across professions, again, who value qualities of character such as fairness, but also honesty, kindness and leadership, have been found more likely to report greater senses of professional purpose towards good societal benefit. And we tested that by not just asking participants to select which virtues were most important to them, but also posing moral dilemmas of them and asking them how they might act in a given situation and how they might justify that action. And then following that up with a report that was only launched last week, we found that 69% of professionals, again, across the 5 professions, indicated that they would deviate from instructional regulation when a potentially more ethical action was available to them. By that, we mean they wouldn't just follow the rules for the rules' sake. They would consider doing having a more ethical approach to a given scenario or situation. This decision to take the alternative action was associated with greater what we call virtue-based reasoning from those who opted to blindly follow instruction. So, what does all this mean? In short, we would argue that in the workplace, it is important both for us as employees and as workers, but also as managers and senior managers and directors and CEOs, etc., to recognise not just fairness in isolation, but actually the character development of those in our care and those in our workforce. And character development can take place in a multitude of different ways, but fairness is just one part of it. Fairness is a very important part and something that is regarded very highly by professionals, but is also just one of a number of different elements of one's character, which can and should be part of any staff development, any CPD, as well as undergraduate training. I'll stop there. Do you want me to, Ali, do you want me to answer the question that was posed around HR now, or should I leave that to yourselves as the experts?
Yeah, I tell you what, I saw that question as well, and I actually, can I just say, was it that came through, was it from Elaine? I actually saw that report and took it to our HRD, Angela, sorry, I took that report to our HRD at CIPD and we both went, oh, right, okay. So yeah, I did see that one as well. I tell you what, actually I wouldn't mind both you and also Marco having an opinion on that Angela's comment at the end, if that's okay. We're not far off question time anyway.
Yeah, certainly.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, I've just got a couple more slides to go, so thanks, Stuart. We are close to the end, and we will be opening up to questions as well as Angela's, which I think is a really, really very, very valid point. So I am quite interested to know, especially in today's times, if we were to run more webinars on the topic of ethics, what would you be interested in? So because this is a free answer, could you please just pop some ideas into our chat box and we will capture those. It may well be that we set up another series of webinars and then we will look to see what kind of responses we this actually came up with, this question came up with, and see what we might be able to do in future. So please pop your ideas and answers in the chat box, and then we'll move on. So, okay, I'm just going to read out a couple of these as they come through, and then move on. Psychological safety, interesting. How can businesses take steps to change the perception of their ethics and fairness? I agree. You'll get that from the guide and the research report. Ethical practices and dilemmas HR professionals face. Yeah, gosh, we face a lot of them. Yes. Okay, how can businesses take steps to change the perception of their ethics and fairness? Ethical practices. Bear with me. Fair communication. Fair ethics. Future ethics. How about one on each of the action areas you mentioned at the beginning? Yeah, do you know what? We just thought we'd try 3. That was Kerry, and just to see how we get on with those, and just really see what the take-up was like before we actually decided on potentially taking the next steps to put another series in place. So training for managers, fairness tips and hints, ethics, whistleblowing. Actually, May, just to let you know that whistleblowing was featured in the very first, which is also under the guise of Speak Up, and that will eventually go on our website. You will be able to just listen to that at your leisure at some point in the future. Okay, role of the board, link to SMCR. Fairness, workforce, cultural, promotions. Perfect. Okay, we've got a few, and I saw reward as well. Thank you very much for that. We will collate that and take that on board. Now, actually, I just wanted to highlight this and just have this on the slide for the moment so you can all see which are some resources, which is our Ethics at Work Guide, the Rotten Apples and Barrels report, and repurposing the profession, the role of professional character, and that was really came from Aidan. And of course, that's just a shot of Marco there with his fabulous TED Talk. There is the URL is in there, and hopefully someone can actually pop that into our chat box. I think Stuart will, and you can go and have a look and see that at a later date. So, questions. So, do you have any questions at all for Aidan or Marco specifically, or myself actually? But whilst you start thinking about those, I think I'm going to go back to that question from Angela. And if I can ask Aidan, you're not muted at the moment. So would you like to give us a response to that?
Yeah, I think the broader response would be that often a focus on ethics or more ethical behaviour, fairness, any other virtue, often comes from some sort of crisis or some sort of negative report or negative perception or scandal. I think we would always say our Jubilee Centre line is that focusing on character and virtues is a good by itself, and it should be part of good education. It should be part of good organisational practice anyway. However, it is often highlighted when it is absent. For the HR sector, then perhaps the best way to go about kind of correcting perceptions or changing perceptions is to be more explicit in the communications, in the language, in the way the sector, organisational bodies, membership bodies talk about the profession, and where there is, and also an acknowledgement that if there has been a particular scandal or a report that is quite damning, then an acknowledgement that that's what the perception is, that try not to hide it, try not to disguise it and move away from it, but actually acknowledging it head on and doing something explicit to change that perception.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks, Aidan. Marco, are we able to unmute you? Would you like to make a comment here as well? So I'm going to try and, yeah, you're unmuted now.
Thanks, Alison. Can you repeat the question? Because
Of course I will.
I don't have it on the chat.
Yeah, bear with me a second. So it was interesting. There was an article published recently that stated HR are viewed as the biggest liars in the workplace and can be viewed as circling the wagons around those employees who raise grievances or whistleblow on unethical senior leadership practices or behaviours. How can HR shake off this perception while serving their leadership community? Yeah, I know. Quite controversial. Yeah. I actually saw that article myself, actually. That was the one I was talking to, and I took it to our HRD at CIPD, and we were quite shocked.
I think the days, as I said in my presentation, the days of lack of transparency are over. People are now able to confront their bonuses and in real time, and especially the younger generations, they request and require constant and continuous feedback. And technology will play a growing role in doing a lot of what HR was traditionally doing in collating the feedbacks. There's going to be a magnitude of apps that continue to gather feedback for 360s in real time and in multiple ways and formats. So I think the new HR director should be, we call them actually a chief fairness officer. Sometimes they should be the stewards of fairness. They should actually be seen to promote that in any way they can. There's no need anymore for that kind of don't say everything to everyone, because otherwise you lose power, and you have to retain power as management and as HR by being scarce with the information. I think those days are gone. I think the HR department should really be working around the processes that we talked about earlier and making sure they promote fairness instead of generating concerns of lack of transparency and honesty.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I love the idea that you call your HR people, the chief fairness officers, and I think that's wonderful. And I think actually, if you notice, we are moving away from sort of personnel or HR professionals as a name, and moving towards people professionals and people practice. And that really should entail and encompass all of those the virtues and fairness, kindness, leadership, good leadership, due diligence should be included in that. I will just say that within the guide that we wrote, on one of my sections, it may have been in the fairness, I can't remember at the moment. I do remember writing about NDAs, and there's certainly been sort of negative publicity in NDAs being sort of a gagging point for people sort of moving on within the organisation. And actually, those should not be used. They are there just to protect things like IP and also, company secrets, not to take away your right to be able to, take or bring grievances to your organisation for some reason, for that reason with an NDA. So we feel I think we're all singing from the same sort of hymn sheet that yes, absolutely, HR should not be seen to do this, and maybe have some work to do to shake this perception, if that is a true perception at the moment. Stuart, are there any other questions?
No, nothing coming through from me. So perhaps in the interest of time, we should move to the last slide and just post the
sorry,
on the next.
There's one question that's come through, literally as you've been speaking.
Oh, lovely.
From Lucy Watson, as fairness is largely down to personality and learnt behaviour that has been ingrained over many years, how do you go about improving this for those who lack empathy for others? In a business with old school culture of leadership, being fair and kind is sometimes perceived as being weak. I think maybe akin to what Marco said there, that maybe the old school way of doing business, I'm working in academia, so I won't pretend to talk about doing business as such, but certainly in academia, a very traditional, old-fashioned at times profession to be in, but also needs to be at the cutting edge of teaching and research, particularly at the moment when none of us can be on campus. That actually, that to say that you lack empathy or the way of doing your business and being in charge is just the way that you've always done it is no longer an excuse. It's no longer a way to act. That this is the 21st century. We're actually 20 years into the 21st century and things have moved on. There are measures out there, and there are tools and resources for focusing on different virtues, empathy included, but how effective they are comes down to that individual. You are right, Lucy, that a lot of this is down to individuality rather than maybe personality. It's got to be, we would say that it's got to be sought by that individual. You've got to want to engage empathetically. You've got to want to be fair before actually being told that you're not being fair. To change your habits and to do things in a different way, you've got to want to do it.
Actually, thank you very much. I agree with that. There's another actual question that's just come through from Yusuf, which is, how can we face fairness inconsistencies where the basic processes are not implemented even when they exist as approved documents? I don't know, Marco, how do you feel? Are you able to answer that question? Do you want me to repeat it?
No, I got the question. I was thinking it's it's already good that the process is there. So I think it's I see the bottle half full. If there's a process that's not being followed, then it's a question for internal audit or whistleblowing. I think the toughest part is to actually get a fair process out there in the first place. And I think going back to the previous question, fairness is often a lot tougher than being cynical and then cutting corners. I mean, fairness is quite always the leads to very tough choices, very strong choices. I think fairness leads to strength, not to weakness, and there's multiple examples of that. When we talk about looking at the heart quotient, the way we call it, is really to try to work on the people who don't feel for others. And the only reason people don't feel for others is that they put themselves ahead of the others. And that leads to maybe being cynical or cutting corners. And people put themselves ahead if they have some inner frustration to feed. And we've, without being a psychology department, being an energy company, but we have very many cases of people who were skeptical and cynical, and then they just bought into it, because once a group starts behaving in a certain way, members naturally adapt. It's not going to lead to miracles, but if you have the right process and you're explicit about it, I think you can really go a long way to bring people along. Everyone's in it to win. It's kind of a win-win outcome, and the people who play a different game end up losing.
Thank you. And it's just something that's occurred to me as well that we mentioned in the guide and also in the research report is that, when you're looking at processes and procedures and in regard to fairness, it should be fair for absolutely everyone that's affected by it and involved in that. And everyone that is should feel that it is a fair process. So that is taking into multiple people with multiple needs, etc. But everyone should agree that it is a fair practice. So thank you very much for your questions. And I think there might be another question coming in, but just we've got one last slide, and I know that we've run over, and I really thank you all, please, for bearing with us. So just the next one, just the next actual webinar is on the 30th of April, Action to Prevent Unethical Behaviour. That is actually going to be presented to you by two of our researchers, which are Johnny Gifford and Mel Green. They actually work in our research department, and in fact they were the authors of Rotten Apples, Bad Barrels and Sticky Situations, the research report I featured earlier. So please do sign up for it if you haven't done so already. And I'm just going to have a quick look just before I let me have a quick look at this last question. and make this the last one before we all go. I understand if you have to go, and I thank you, and I thank you all for attending. So Perry says, we are all seeing in the current crisis COVID-19 stark differences between those who are being kind, helpful, supportive, and those who are profiteering from the situation. We see these differences in work, and we need to look at ways of sorry, I just lost my section there. Bear with me, sorry. We see this difference in work, and we need to look at ways of outing this behaviour as abhorrent, unacceptable, and not tolerated. So, and maybe that was just as a statement rather than a question. So thank you very much for that, Kerry. And everyone's going agreed. So I just want to say thank you so much for attending, and I wish you all well. Stay well and stay safe. And it just remains me to say thank you so much to my guest speakers, and that's Mark Alvera and Aidan Thompson, and also Stuart for chairing the webinar. All the best, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone.